This podcast was made possible by the kind support of Speaking with Images, a firm focused on motivational speaking, increasing resilience, improving communication, and building better workplace cultures.
Well, I have to say that I think for women in investment management, it's got worse. That there are many fewer women around in the investment management industry, except perhaps on the client relations side. I'm too far away from what goes on day to day in offices now to know why that should be. But I do not feel it's gone well, particularly. And I don't understand quite what's happened or why, but I do perceive it.
Our next guest retired to a portfolio career over 20 years ago. Let's hear about her remarkable journey that demonstrates how some things really have changed, but how some have stayed the same. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Caroline Burton, who has a portfolio career, which includes roles as an independent advisor to local authority pension plans and a non-executive director role. She previously spent over 25 years at the Guardian Royal Exchange, where she was promoted to manager at the age of 28. She retired from that organisation in 1999 and has since built her portfolio career. Welcome, Caroline. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Let's start with talking about your background and how investing kind of presented itself as a career choice for you.
Well, I certainly never thought that that's where I was going to end up. Not that I think many people really have long-term career plans, but I grew up in an academic environment in Oxford. I always assumed I was going to be an academic, and my great enthusiasm was for French literature, and particularly for medieval French literature. So I did my first degree. I started off on a doctorate, and I'd always assumed that teaching was one of the prices you paid for doing research. But after a year or two of doing the research, I decided that actually this was not what I wanted to do. I needed to change my life. And so I went out and got interviewed for just about every job you could think of. But I had some friends who were working in the city as investment analysts. And I thought, well, that's perhaps not so different from doing academic research. They seem to enjoy it. Maybe this is something I can do. So I went along for various interviews, encountering a fair deal of sexism along the way, I have to say. But when I got to Guardian Royal Exchange, the then head of investment said to me, well, why do you think what you're doing has prepared you to do investment analysis? And I said, well, I've learned to make a decent hypothesis out of totally inadequate evidence. And he said, you're hired. So that's how I started out. So I started out as an analyst on global markets because the organization was divided into UK and global. And when I started out, I thought I was going to be a backroom person, an analyst, and that seemed okay. And I enjoyed doing what I did. But people were obviously looking at what I did, and they said to me, no, you're much too interested in the price, you better go on the desk. So they gave me a role managing Asian portfolios. That may seem quite odd, but in fact, at that date, the Asian markets in Japan were just really starting to open up, and women were starting to come into the city. So if you look at the women my age who did get into fund management, you'll find that a disproportionate number of them actually were working in the Asian markets. But then I got made a supervisor of 2 or 3 other people and began to realize that I had talent as a manager as well as an investment manager. And it was at that point that I started wanting to take on bigger roles in investment management. And at that point, I started thinking about my career in terms of getting to the top of an investment organization.
And I'd love to just ask you, looking back, you said you encountered a bit of sexism along the way. Did you find that people just didn't take you seriously going to these roles, that they didn't think that you were going to necessarily pursue it for the long haul?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you my favorite interview story. I went for an interview at one of the merchant banks. I think I shouldn't say which. And I was asked, well, my dear, what would happen if you fell in love with somebody who lived in Edinburgh? I said, tell him to get a job in London. That did not go down well.
Fantastic answer. And when it came to you, when you realized you did want to progress through the organization, that you had an ambition to rise through the top, was there any person who encouraged you or that you saw as a mentor that helped you take those steps?
I don't think I could say I had a mentor. I mean, I learnt an enormous amount from an enormous number of different people. Probably some of the most useful things I learnt was what not to do. But I certainly had a sponsor, and a sponsor for, I suppose, my wider ambitions, in that the head of investment who recruited me did take an interest in me. He wasn't the kind of person who would ever become a mentor because he was a very shy man. But, for example, one day he happened to come past my desk when I was writing something, and he just said casually, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on a piece just for myself out of interest about cross-selling of financial service products, because it was all the rage in the US at the time, and I was somewhat skeptical about how it was going to work out." And he said, "Oh, I'd like to see that." So when I'd finished, I gave it to him, and he took it to after having read it, he took it to the group executive committee saying, "Look, here's something we've been thinking about, and here's a really intelligent piece of work that we all ought to take seriously." And he also got me involved, because people saw me as a rising talent, I suppose, by then, in things like group development work. One of the problems the group felt it had was that it was recruiting a lot of very good young graduates who went through the training scheme, but then only hung around for 2 or 3 years. So a group was set up, which I led, to look at what was happening and why. So I got, through him, exposure to the rest of the organization and a recognition that I had managerial ability. But it was very much a sponsorship role rather than a mentoring one.
It's a really interesting distinction you draw, because I don't think I've really thought about it that way before, that if somebody is maybe, as you said, shy or more of an introvert and doesn't maybe naturally feel comfortable in an active mentoring situation, sponsorship can be done quite silently and according to their style. So I think it's something probably we don't appreciate, that maybe people can be sponsors without being mentors. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think it is a different relationship. And I don't think necessarily, I'm not sure that if I'd been told, here's somebody to be a mentor, at that time I would have been particularly interested in it. And I'm always a bit skeptical about the motivation of some mentors. Are they trying to mold people in their own image, which is not a good thing.
Very interesting. And then when you started progressing and were managing people, you were still, I presume, in quite a minority there, as you had been from the outset. Were there any issues in managing not such a diverse group, maybe managing people older than you?
I never really found it so. I wasn't managing anybody much older than me. Most of the group I was managing were my contemporaries, and there were some other women inside the investment operation. Now, the only interesting thing that we had as a sort of discrimination issue was we had hierarchical staff restaurants. And when you were promoted to what was called a superintendent, which was a sort of junior level of management, theoretically, you were supposed to go and eat in a separate restaurant. But this restaurant was men only. And there was yet another restaurant for the secretaries and assistant general managers. And the only woman who'd been in a junior supervisory role before me had accepted going along to this secretary's mess. I just decided I'd stay in the ordinary canteen. And, I really wasn't that bothered by it. And then there was a woman who was at my level in internal audit. And she came to me one day and she said, "Look, I'm fed up with this stupid nonsense about the restaurants, Caroline. If I threaten my boss with the Equal Opportunities Act about it, will you threaten yours?" And I laughed and I said, "Well, I don't suppose it'll do any good, but I don't think Norman will be terribly upset, so why not?" A restaurant was open to us in a week.
It's incredible. I don't think anyone would be wistful for those good old days of segregated restaurants. That sounds truly anachronistic today, but good for you for removing that vestige of the old-fashioned ways.
Well, of course, there were still restaurants, commercial restaurants in the city then, which wouldn't allow women in.
And were these clubs of some kind?
No, these were public restaurants, but they wouldn't admit women on the basis of they didn't have the right lavatories. I've had 1 or 2 embarrassing experiences with stockbrokers who'd invited me out to lunch and booked a table at one of these restaurants, having to have me turned away. I just thought it was a bit of a joke, but I think it was pretty embarrassing for the poor men involved.
Just to give us a feel for people who come trying to even imagine this, what kind of decade was this? The 70s, the 80s?
70s, mid-70s.
Okay, so that's, well, thankfully we've moved on from that. But hard to believe even then. So after such a long career in investing, are there any kind of key investment beliefs that you still hold, and maybe now, given you're still in investment advisory roles?
I think I'd say you've got to stay flexible, you've got to keep listening, and you've got to never believe your own PR. One of my colleagues used to have a little sign on her desk which said, "Never confuse brains in a bull market." I think as an investor, my core beliefs are that things are changing all the time and that investment is very much a fashion business. And you've got to be able to identify when those changes in fashion happen and also not to get sucked into investing in things because they're fashionable. As an investor, I think what I was best at was spotting changing trends rather than necessarily being the very best at saying you should buy stock X rather than stock Y.
Very interesting. And I think also your point about not believing your own PR is quite interesting, because I do think the more time you spend surrounded by hubris and egos, the better you get at detecting it and sort of seeing through it. Yeah. And I'm sure you had your fair share of hubris and egos around you.
Yes, it could be a problem. No, in fact, because people tended to go through our organisation fairly quickly, that wasn't so much a problem. I mean, one of the big problems I had was having constantly to rebuild the team, because at the time, the insurance industry, and it wasn't just my company, were unwilling to recognise that they had to pay investment people very differently from the people who worked on the insurance side. So as a result, we used to get a lot of very good young graduates in. They'd stay with us for 2 or 3 years, and then they got bought away for a lot more money. So there was a constant rebuild. And I suppose the only reason why I didn't take that exit route myself at some points was because I could see that if I stayed where I was, I had the opportunity to get to a higher level than was probably true if I went a lot of places outside.
And let's go back again. We discussed diversity in the industry, and now here we are in the 2020s, and we've made some progress, but maybe not a lot, maybe not enough. Do you have any thoughts on how the diversity of the industry has evolved and what you'd like to see?
I have a stepdaughter who's in the industry, who's in her early 50s. And it seems to us both, there are many fewer women around in the investment management industry, except perhaps on the client relations side. I'm too far away from what goes on day to day in offices now to know why that should be. But I do not feel it's gone well, particularly. And I don't understand quite what's happened or why, but I do perceive it. There are many fewer women around.
You're not the only person to have shared that view. And it's sort of why we're trying to focus on these points and see at what part of the chain is the problem arising. Is it possibly everywhere, but certainly the entry level, but the retention level, maybe the lifestyle has changed and is less appealing to what it looked like maybe back in the 80s, 90s. But it is a puzzle for sure.
It seems to me strange that it's investment management. I mean, I can see why for women with families, perhaps the kind of investment banking world where you're supposed to be at the client, available to the client 24/7 might not be appealing. But investment management is not like that. Certainly doesn't need to be like that. I'm baffled from the slight distance I now sit.
Just getting back to some of your current roles in your portfolio career as an independent advisor, what do you seek to bring to those roles and how do you add value?
I think as a non-executive, your role really is to support the team who do the management of the business day to day, but to question them. And I always think it's like holding up a mirror a lot of the time, showing people how it looks in the mirror and saying, is this really what you mean? Is this really what you want? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? But it's very different from the executive role. I mean, I think the best description that I was ever given by it was by a friend. And she said, well, it's very simple. Eyes on, hands off. And I think that's it. I'm grateful though that I became a non-executive before I ceased being an executive. I think it was much easier to develop an appropriate style as a non-exec while doing the other role, because you would feel the differences and the tensions all the time. As far as what I bring to the local authority role, it's strategic investment views and the ability to challenge managers and also challenge the investment consultants. And a lot of the time, I would say over all the years I've been doing it, the most important thing I've said to people is don't do this. You bought a certain manager because you like their style. The style's currently out of fashion at the moment. Within their style, they're doing all right. Don't sack people at the bottom of the performance cycle. Hang on in there. And on the other side, you'll be bought a lot of products to look at and be told they're wonderful and fashionable and the greatest thing ever. Don't get sucked into things just for the sake of it. Make very sure that these are things that really fit your strategy, that really differentiate, that really are going to add value. I mean, I always used to say, people, there used to be that big conference down at Southampton, which then I think moved to somewhere out in Wales. And my first question to committees coming back from that is, well, what are they trying to flog you this time? I thought I've always seen part of my role as to protect by assisting people in questioning things.
I completely identify with that myself. I see it as almost a kind of a shoring up a knowledge base, because I think of knowledge as being power and lack of knowledge as being perhaps a vulnerability, where that's exactly when inappropriate products can be peddled. Interesting that we shared that view. And now that you have retired for some time now, officially retired, obviously still extremely busy. If you were to look back at your career, would you say there were any high points and low points of it?
I would say that the high point was getting appointed to the main board of Guardian Royal Exchange. Again, I think there were 3, 4 women who previously had done that, and they'd all been finance directors. And I do think that's one of the easier roles for women to get recognition in, being a finance director, because it's very number focused, very easy to give people the points or not. And also, I was still quite young. I mean, I was 40. Now, to be appointed to a FTSE 100 board, whatever sex you are, at 40 would not be so extraordinary, but back in 1990, it still was. And I have to say that I know that some of the non-executive directors were quite nervous about my appointment. I know because one of them, 6 months after I'd been on the board, said to me, some of us were a bit nervous about having a woman join the board. Weren't we stupid? To which I could hardly say yes, but obviously that's what I thought. So I'd say that was the high point. The low point was Guardian Royal Exchange being taken over in 1999. I mean, external analysts tell me that it was only because the investment team managed to keep the net asset value doing as well as it did that it didn't happen a few years earlier. So that's nice. But obviously, I saw everything I'd built up basically destroyed. And while I came out of it okay, because I had the right to take an immediate pension and I got 12 months contract to pay out, a lot of the people who worked for me did not have such good outcomes. So it was a fairly traumatic experience in some ways. I mean, I've been through, as a non-exec, 2 hostile takeovers subsequent to that. It's never a pleasurable experience, but at least then I wasn't seeing a team destroyed from underneath me, which wasn't good.
And I would imagine when you've been in an organization so long, it feels like part of your family, part of who you are, your identity. So I suppose that is a traumatic experience in leaving.
Funnily enough, I think it's also true even with non-executive directorships. You're involved with an organization for 9 years and then suddenly, you go. It's a bit like being on a ship that comes into port and you get off the boat and the boat sails off and for a little while people wave at you goodbye and then the ship disappears into the distance and it's going on and its life is going on and you're left behind on the quay. So I think it's always a break.
True. Well, obviously, the more engaged you are, the more committed you are, the more you'll feel that. And it's wonderful, I think, when you do feel that, because you will have given it your whole self. That's an interesting observation. Now that you're in retirement, what passions are you exploring and have you been exploring over the past 20 years?
I don't think I've been doing anything very different to what I did before. I've just got more time to do it. I mean, the things that I enjoy doing, I enjoy walking a lot. I'm cross-country skiing in the winter. I enjoy the arts, particularly opera and Baroque music, going to exhibitions. And I did all those things before, but it's just a question of having more time. It's easier to organize. I love cooking. And in lockdown, I've been doing an awful lot more than I used to because I also enjoy eating out. But suddenly it's become cook 2 meals a day every day. Actually, it's been great fun. I've enjoyed it, though I won't be sorry to be able to get to some good restaurants again. But nothing's kind of changed dramatically differently. There wasn't ever something I thought, when I'm retired, I shall be able to do X. I've been able to travel a bit more, which has been nice. So at first, when I retired from full-time work, having spent a lot of time on jumbo jets, doing kind of fairly intense trips to Asia 4 times a year, and my husband also having spent a lot of his life on aeroplanes, we decided we were not going to do any long-haul travel for a while. But we have done some travel since then. And I think one of the very lucky things we did was in that little window when you could go to Libya, we went, and it was a fantastic trip. And terrible to think that a lot of the wonderful monuments we saw have now been damaged. I think not all cases irreparably, but it's really, really sad.
And it's also wonderful you got that travel done before travel has been curtailed, I suppose, recently. So I have a huge passion for travel myself, so I completely understand. Now, looking back at we've mentioned some key people. You mentioned your sponsor, other people who encouraged you in your career. Are there any others you can mention, or maybe any key pieces of advice that you received that you have carried with you through the years?
I can't honestly say that I have. I've just known so many different people, so many of whom have given me, I'm sure, things that I took in, but I can't remember ever ticking in the brain to say, oh yes, that's something I want to put away and remember. So I think it's been more a question of osmosis than anything else.
That's very important too. I mean, I think that is, these are the people who energize us. We may take aspects of their personalities and not others that we find we are motivated by, but I think just being surrounded by intelligent, motivating people is also very important. Any creed or motto that you live by as you now look at whether your career or in retirement?
I think certainly in my career, the thing I would say is keep listening. I think most of us are not good enough at listening. And hearing is one thing, listening is another. People used to say to me in some of my NED roles, you're not saying a lot. And I often used to say, there are a lot of people around this board table who say too much because they like the sound of their own voices. But the really important thing is to listen and listen and listen and take in everything that's being said, because then you've got a better chance of understanding.
And then my last question is around any advice you might have for your younger self. Knowing what you know now, is there anything you wish you had known then?
I think if I had known that my real talent was a managerial talent, I would have started thinking about how to develop that more earlier on. I suppose it might also have pushed me towards other careers, though I'm glad it didn't. But I think, again, that was a question of listening, of learning what people were saying about me, what they were saying I could do, rather than me sitting down and trying to think, oh, yes, great, I'm going to do this or that or the other. Yeah, I'd say that was the thing.
Something we arguably all don't do enough of, but learning to listen. That's something I've learned in this podcast series is actually a gift. Well, thank you so much, Caroline. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and to hear your recollections of such a long and illustrious career. I think it's been very motivating to us to hear how you progressed at such an early age and your lessons learned. So thank you for coming and sharing your insights with us.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.